Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Sylvia Levy, and I'm the Communications Officer for the Agriculture, Nutrition and Health, or ANH Academy, and the Imana program based at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Thank you so much for joining us today for the fourth and last webinar in our series about drivers of food choice in low and middle income countries, a synthesis of evidence. This series is co-hosted by the ANH Academy and the Drivers of Food Choice program at the University of South Carolina. Today's session is on changing values and food choice, implications for demand creation in LMIC, and we have a slate of great speakers for you to engage with. So before we get started, I'd like to go over a few technical items so you all know how to participate in the webinar today. This webinar will be recorded and posted on the ANH Academy website. All participants have been muted, but please introduce yourselves using the chat box. Let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and the organization you work with. Please also rename yourself in the Zoom call with the name you'd like people to use. You can access the chat box by clicking the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And later in the section, we will open up the conversation with a question and answer session. If you have questions, we invite you to share them in the chat box throughout the session. You can also send your questions in at any time during the webinar, and we will do our best to raise them during the Q&A. If we have time, we may also ask you to raise your hand in the Zoom window so that you can ask your question using the audio function. And lastly, if at any point you experience technical issues, please check your audio settings and your internet connection. And if you get lost, please just try to reconnect to the webinar using the same link from your email. That's it from me. Now over to Joe Yates, co-director of the ANH Academy.
Thanks, Sylvia. Just a quick word, not to get in the way of the webinar too much, but on behalf of the Academy and also of Sunitha Kadiyala, who can't be here today, just want to say a massive thank you to everyone who's been involved in the series so far, to all of the Drivers of Food Choice team, Ed, Christine, Shiva, Shilpa, Emma, Ligia, and so many more people, and all of the presenters over the last 3 and now 4 series of this of the webinars. It's been a really rich discussion, and really it's exactly what the Academy is set up to do, and it's really our bread and butter. It's our mission really to help support the uptake of research and the dissemination of findings, and this is such an important topic and a growing area of interest, and to understand what are the drivers of food choice in low income settings, and to also understand what this means and how that can fit into actions around food environments and food systems. But seems particularly important this year, and in the wake of, well, not quite the wake, but in the midst of COVID-19 and with the Food Systems Summit and so forth on the horizon. Also want to say thanks to Sylvia and Abel for organising the event from our end. It takes a lot behind the scenes to make sure these things run off smoothly, and for all the participants who have been so active and engaged in the rich discussions, and I hope that the discussions can continue as well beyond this, and I'm sure that there's a lot of appetite for that among the community. One thing I wanted to say is that obviously the Academy is a big tent ethos, and the webinar series like this really speaks to that interdisciplinary nature of our community, and I'm hoping that many of you will be members already, but if you're not a member of the Academy, do consider signing up. It's free, and there's lots of ways that you can share your own evidence and findings through the website. Of course, we're living in now a virtually completely online environment, but before this time we had lots of in-person meetings as well. And you know, our main flagship event is the ANH Academy Week, which is going to be happening this year online again for the second time in June, late June and early July. So it's going to be a 2-week affair. The first week is going to be all about learning labs, skills-based workshops. So really do try and get involved. We'd love to have you take part in that. There's lots of opportunities to sign up for the learning labs, and this year we've packed in as many as we can. We've got over 20 different offerings. So come and have a look. And the second week is going to be about the research conference, and there's going to be a lot of evidence being shared that week. So yeah, just to put that in your diaries. And thanks again for everyone who's been involved in this. And if you want to propose a webinar series in the future, just give us an email. We're open to any ideas at all. So looking forward to working with you in the future. Cheers. And now I think I'm passing over to Ed to take it forward.
Well, thank you, Joe and Sylvia. I'm Ed Frangillo. I'm a professor at the University of South Carolina and a member of the Drivers of Food Choice team, and we're grateful for the opportunity to collaborate with Amana on this webinar series. The motivation for the series has been recognizing the importance of understanding the roles and implications of global food systems and globalization for agriculture and markets, food choice, nutrition and health in low and middle income countries. And in this webinar series in particular, we focused on these issues from the perspective of food choice, meaning understanding what, how, and why people choose the foods they do. Food choice occurs within the context of and is influenced by people's livelihoods, how they make their living, and changes in livelihoods can force or catalyze changes in food choice, and that's the topic for today. So first we'll begin with an overview provided by Ligia Reyes, who's a member of the Drivers of Food Choice team. And then we'll hear presentations from Amy Wedd-Gerard, Amy Ikowitz, and Stella Nordharden, presenting examples from their work in Tanzania, Indonesia, and Guinea, respectively. So I'll turn it over to Ligia. She'll give her short presentation, and then we'll continue with the others. And then at the end, we'll have ample time for discussion. Anytime along the way, please enter any questions you might have into the chat, and we'll be monitoring that and take up those questions at the end. So Ligia.
Thank you, Ed. Can everyone see my screen okay? Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you today for our fourth and final webinar of this series on drivers of food choice. Today, we'll be looking into the relationship between changing livelihoods and food choice. We would like to thank our funders, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, as well as the entire DFC family of grantees, technical advisors, and collaborators. Livelihoods are a means for securing the necessities of life. The means by which people live enable them to acquire material resources for subsistence, such as food, income, and land, and achieve non-material goals, such as maintaining social status or belonging to a particular group. People engage in livelihood strategies, which are a combination of activities to achieve their livelihood goals. Livelihood strategies have a strong role in patterning of daily life, including time use, food practices, income level, and stability, and standard of living, which can help elucidate nutritional and health trajectories. People in low and middle income countries are experiencing changes in their livelihoods, which are at least partly due to rapid transitions that could occur in the environment, including the impact of climate change, economic development, including rural to urban migration, but also within rural settings, culture, especially through new exposures via migration, and political, such as policies related to land and production. A focus on changing livelihoods can improve the current understanding on how individuals and households navigate environmental, economic, cultural, and political transitions, how these changes relate to their food choices, and can inform programs and policy for sustainable, healthy diets. The purpose of the Drivers of Food Choice program is to synthesize and disseminate research to provide a deep understanding of the drivers of food choice among the poor in developing countries in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. As a reminder, food choice is a process about what, how, and why people produce, acquire, prepare, allocate, and consume the foods that they do. Across DFC studies, we're learning that changing livelihoods co-occur with and possibly influence changes in food environments through consumer demand and agricultural decision-making, as well as adaptations in food choice. Evidence from the DFC-Portfolio provides important insights about how changing livelihoods drive food choice across important food behaviors. For example, in production, as people relocated to engage in new livelihood strategies, they had less opportunities to produce their own foods. Policies, such as subsidies of staple foods, also contributed to the types of crops that smallholders cultivated. For food acquisition, as people engaged in new livelihood strategies, acquiring foods from markets as opposed to producing them became more prominent. Food purchases depended on what was accessible, convenient, and affordable, and were also more energy dense. In food preparation, food frying was becoming more common, which was also linked to the affordability of oil. Food preparation also indicated disproportionate time expectations of women, and urban living conditions also limited the time that people could dedicate to food preparation. In household food allocation, as women spent more time, in particular, in income-generating roles, older children took on responsibilities to feed younger siblings. And for actual food consumption, evidence indicated that the composition of diets is changing. In some contexts, there was higher consumption of staple foods due to the ubiquity and affordability. There was also higher consumption of ready-to-eat foods due to their convenience. As people became exposed to new foods, they were also more willing to at least try them, which contributed to changing food preferences. For an in-depth look at some of these learnings, we will begin the webinar with a presentation by Dr. Amy Webb-Gerard on how sedentarization shifts diets in traditional pastoral communities in Tanzania. We will then hear from Dr. Amy Ikowitz about how adoption of oil palm production affects food choices in indigenous communities in Indonesia. And finally, we will learn from Dr. Stella Nordhagen about artisanal gold mining livelihoods and food choice in Guinea. We hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar, and we look forward to rich discussion after these presentations.
Thank you, Lihia. So Amy Webb.
Amy, you might be muted if you can try to unmute.
Oh, you're right.
yourself.
Sorry, that happens. Y'all just see my mouth moving, but nothing comes out. It's how I feel when I talk to my children. But anyway, I'm going to be talking today, presenting on behalf of our team working in Tanzania to understand how rapid sedentarization among traditionally pastoral communities is affecting food choice and diet patterns in these communities. So pastoralists represent approximately 500 million people globally. They are typically nomadic herdsmen with large herds of cattle, inclusive of small ruminants like goats, and then larger ruminants such as cattle and camel. And they have, over many decades, been increasingly sedentarizing. They have been moving into more sedentary lifestyles as a result of environmental, social, population, and political and geopolitical pressures. As they shift to these more sedentary lifestyles, this process of sedentarization, research, especially in East Africa where we work, suggests that their diet quality and diet quantity are being negatively impacted. Much of the research is coming out around child nutrition specifically, with decreased consumption of animal source foods and increasing consumption of energy-dense staples. But these energy-dense staples are often lower in high-quality protein and micronutrients. So our research aimed to understand the complex drivers of food choice in these communities as they undergo this process of sedentarization, and really are experiencing in a microcosm the rapid nutrition transition that we see happening globally. We're really exploring the environmental and economic pressures that are contributing to sedentarization, and then also the concomitant results of that related to socioculture, gender norms, and food valuation that may result as they become more sedentary. We were also looking at some additional and intersecting drivers of food choice and diet change. To achieve our research outcomes, we applied a longitudinal mixed methods approach, conducting 2 rounds of rapid ethnographic research with findings from the first round feeding into and informing the second round of research. This included key informant interviews, focus group discussion, community mapping, household interviews. And then we also conducted 3 different rounds of market survey research and applied Save the Children's cost of the diet approach to estimate costs of different diets in terms of their nutritional value, whether they were energy dense, micronutrient rich, or nutritious diets, and also based on what was available and acceptable in the communities. Our data collection was conducted, just as background, in 2017 and 2018, and across different seasons in order to capture seasonal variability. So in terms of the populations where we worked within Tanzania, just as some background, Tanzania has the 3rd largest livestock holding in Africa, of which 95% of those livestock are going to be kept by pastoralist communities. And indeed, 61 million hectares of Tanzanian land are classified as under pastoral management. So pastoral communities represent a large and significant population for Tanzania, especially in the context of food and food systems. So we focused our research in 2 different regions in Tanzania, Morogoro, here in more south, and then Tanga, which was somewhat north. Both regions have extensive cattle keeping and other animal husbandry activities as their primary livelihood strategy, and both have varying degrees of sedentarization among their communities. These 2 communities or regions were selected because our partner, the International Livestock Research Institute, had been working in these communities for several years in the context of dairy development and creating out dairy co-ops to promote dairy development. They had been working in 20 communities across these 2 regions. And so we proposedly selected 6 as the focus of our research, selecting them based on the predominant livestock livelihood strategy in those communities, and then ensuring variability across ethnic groups. And just as a explanation, extensive pastoralists were defined as those communities where large herds of more than 20 cattle, typically indigenous breeds, predominate, and the communities practice the transhumanist nomadic pastoral strategies. In more intense or extensive sedentary communities, these communities have less of a nomadic existence. They tend to stay within one location and have somewhat smaller herds that may include more hybrid breeds. And then our intensive sedentary communities do a much more intensive mix of crop cultivation, and they have much smaller herds with typically more exotics or more hybrid breeds, and practice more zero grades type foraging systems. We selected the Sustainable Livelihoods framework to inform our research because previous research highlights the specific role of food in sustainable livelihoods among these communities, specifically in terms of social status, gender norms, and the ways in which people interact with a number of different capital. So in the context of pastoral communities, animals and animal source foods serve as the backbone for financial and economic capital and income and economic reserves. The value of these foods for health and well-being, which signifies human capital, also is critical. And then the framework also allows us to consider some of the interacting forces of natural capital in terms of how these communities are interacting with their environment and the ways in which that's shifting their decision-making for livelihood strategies. Today, we're going to focus this presentation on 2 primary aspects of our findings. The first is understanding changes that have occurred in the diets in these communities, and then a brief discussion of some of the key drivers that we've identified. And so to get us started, I'd like to present just a representative quote that illustrates the changes that we've seen. So if you'll notice, this is coming from Elder Maasai men from focus group discussions there in an extensive pastoral community. They note how in their young ages, they would eat meat, milk, cow blood, and they ate a type of cooled boiled maize and milk porridge, as that was the backbone of their diets. And they would eat other things that they could forage and harvest, bulrush millet. And then as other foods were introduced, some tuberous like Irish and sweet potatoes. When you compare that to how they say that people are eating currently, in another extensive pastoral community, a Maasai woman had expressed to us it's really changed because I've seen people eating chicken and chips enriched with eggs. And in the past, we did not eat eggs, but in these days, we're eating eggs, we eat fish, we eat sardines, and specifically, this is in reference to tinned or packaged sardines, vegetables, which we did not eat in the past. People have now changed their eating habit. And when we summarize these different types of changes across the different community types that we have, what we see is that in our extensive pastoral communities, while you still do have milk and blood being consumed, meat being consumed to a lesser degree as it used to be, there still remains some avoidance of other meat sources like poultry, eggs, and fish. Wild vegetables are still a more predominant food source, but that's rapidly changing as wild foraged goods become less and less available. And you see the introduction of cultivated vegetables. Among the youth, they are the ones that are driving some of these changes in the more extensive pastoral communities, with youth in these communities talking about the consumption or increased consumption of grains such as maize and ugali, beans, sweet potatoes, the cultivated vegetables, chicken, and eggs. But again, these are more among the youth. And even to that degree, youth are consuming it less in the extensive pastoralist communities relative to some of the other types of communities. And while boiling and grilling are still very common strategies for food preparation, with the concomitant use of animal fats and sesame and pumpkin seed as fats, you are slowly seeing this introduction of oils that Ligia and others have mentioned earlier as these become more widely available and affordable. As we move into sedentarized populations, both extensive and intensive, we see much greater dependence on our tuber and grain staples, and an increased variety in terms of cultivated vegetables, but with less dependence on wild foraged vegetables. And again, chicken, eggs, and fish are becoming more common meat sources, though I should say that while these are more commonly consumed, they still are not consumed on a daily basis, as they are quite expensive still. You will also see the introduction of more convenience foods, such as tinned fish and prepackaged food, snacks, soda, alcohol, and then restaurant prepared foods or hotel foods, as they would call them. And again, a much greater dependence on deep oil frying and sauteing with oil, as opposed to using seeds and animal fats for their cooking processing. So when we think about all the things that might be contributing to these changes, our work identified a multitude of actors and factors that were sort of simultaneously converging and that have been converging over the past several generations to really begin to shift diet culture and diet practices. These range from environmental factors such as climate variability and increasing aridity and heat, to the introduction of health and agricultural education into different communities. And so as communities settle and have more exposure to a number of these different things, we begin to see changes in food availability, food affordability, and food acceptability. And I'll now walk through sort of each of our drivers of availability, affordability, and acceptability, talking about these with representative quotes. So in terms of availability, technology, expanding market infrastructure, and this livelihood shift towards more sedentary livelihoods has really increased the availability of processed maize meal, refined oils, and cultivated vegetables, especially tomatoes and onions. Those were really coming out as the prominent cultivated vegetables that have spread across all the different population groups. The increased availability and economies of scale that technology and market infrastructure have introduced, as well as increased crop cultivation, these have driven prices down on these particular types of food, which is making them much more affordable. And people are beginning to consume more of those in regards to the affordability. On the flip side, climate variability and the ways in which climate change and population pressures have influenced cattle themselves and the herds in terms of herd health have had direct negative impacts on milk production, thus driving down milk availability and driving up costs. So we see these different factors, these different influencers affecting foods in different ways. So increasing availability and affordability of refined foods and cultivated vegetables, and driving down availability and increasing costs of milk, meat, and other animal source foods, with the exception of eggs. We also see a very interesting change in availability at the household level because of competing demands in relation to social values and changing social values, with pastoralists talking about now selling their cattle to pay for school fees and healthcare fees and other types of socially valued systems, as opposed to slaughtering those animals and consuming them for food, or using the milk for home production. They're now selling it to allocate money towards these other competing demands. And so these factors are all converging to shift availability of different foods in different ways. With these shifts in availability, we do see shifts in affordability, and this influences the market prices for all foods in a very seasonally driven manner. In general, recent changes in variability of climate in these communities, especially increased aridity or decreased rainfall and increased heat, has really caused crop failure across the board in these communities. So those who had shifted from pastoralism into cultivation are now suffering as a result of diminished crop productivity as a result of climate variability. And so what we're seeing are micro changes in food costs that are affecting household food purchasing. And when we apply cost of diet analysis to these market data, we note that nutritious diets are really out of reach of many households, especially as households become more and more dependent on markets for their food as opposed to home production. We're seeing the dependence on markets become a problem in terms of affording and having available nutritious foods. And as microclimate failures occur and crop failures occur, markets, in order to bring in foodstuffs, will become more important. So we need to be thinking about the ways in which affordability in the markets is influencing household food availability and nutritious diets. But interestingly, despite all of these sort of environmental and economic drivers, when we spoke with communities about what they thought were the #1 drivers of changing diets, they really talked about this notion of inter-ethnic exchange, the ways in which migration and the settling of communities together into towns and urban centers has really allowed for this exchange of ideas. Bringing people together, exchanging ideas, exchanging practices, giving people the opportunity to try new things. That was what they defined as being the biggest driver of food change in their communities. And in relation to these two sub-values or two subsystems of interethnic exchange emerged related to religion, specifically religion as an influencer of milk consumption and the ways in which, blood consumption, and the ways in which religion has created a taboo around blood consumption that has really driven down that practice in communities as they become more sedentary and settled. And then lastly, education, another source of interethnic exchange, also had other ways in which it affected food choice. So many families, especially mothers, spoke of how their children would go to school, learn new ideas, interact with other ethnic groups, other children, and bring home new ideas around food preparation, and actually demand these foods in their home, make demands on their families to provide these foods and prepare these foods. Another way in which education drove food availability and food choice was, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of how families are now having to sell what would have been food for home consumption in order to procure income for supporting fees. And then lastly, people spoke of broader community health education and agricultural education as a driver of this change, especially when pregnant and lactating women would go to health facilities. They would learn about new ways to eat to support nutrition, and then they would bring that diet home and begin to implement those in their home. So while us in nutrition sometimes wonder if any of our nutrition education programs are effective, what we're seeing potentially is some direct outcomes from that. And so we are seeing that various modes of education have ways of influencing diet choice in sort of a slow pattern. And so to summarize, what we've seen is that multiple competing and converging environmental, economic, and social pressures are contributing to sort of food insecurity and economic insecurity on the one hand, which leads to sedentarization. And then that process of sedentarization interacts with a number of changing social values and social interactions that ultimately shift the way people think about food and perceive food and the ways in which they will be more open and accepting to new foods. And then that becomes the new habit. So in conclusion, I just want to reiterate what I know we've talked about earlier, is that diets are changing rapidly in this population. And as we see in many populations globally, diets are changing rapidly. And there's no one driver. I mean, these are really multiple converging pressures in this process of globalization that's driving these changes in food choice and diet practices. And so it's going to require multiple dimensions to address. What once was traditional is now considered more ceremonial, partly because of changing preferences, partly because of changing availability. And what was once reserved for ceremony is now becoming more traditional because it might be the more accessible. And then changing affordability and availability are key drivers, but social pressures in this particular context may be more influential. The influence of religion in schools should not be underestimated because it may also serve as a very useful platform for future action. If we're thinking about how we think to reshape food preferences and food diet in order to promote more nutritious diets, including what might be more traditional to bring back blood or milk consumption or wild vegetable consumption. And then other things that I didn't speak to as much today, but some of our own research and the research of others have really highlighted how government policies around pastoralism and in multiple countries have really marginalized pastoralists over the past several decades. And as a result, contributed to these pressures that moved them towards sedentarization. But these may have inadvertently reduced access to highly nutritious foods. And this has implications for a number of maternal and child health issues, as well as chronic disease outcomes. And so when we think about policies around pastoralisms from more of a geopolitical and development perspective, we really need to be thinking about land and water access, improving climate resiliency, and maintaining cattle health, and doing so in ways that can still support nutritious diets. So I just want to say thank you to my team and thank you to the Drivers of Food Choice team for all the support they've provided us over the past several years, and to the donors that provided us funding to do this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. Again, please, any questions you have, put it in the chat box. Our next presentation is by Amy Ikowitz. So welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Can you see my slides?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
But we're hopeful.
Yeah.
Me too. Sylvia, could you maybe share from the central slide?
Yes. Yes, can do. I'm on it. All you'll need to do is just tell me when to go to the next slide.
Okay, thanks.
Perfect.
Great, thank you so much. So hi everybody, and thank you Amy for a really interesting talk. I think there's lots of parallels with what I'm going to be presenting now. So I'm going to be presenting some findings from our Drivers of Food Choice project that was on changing, oh hi Ed. Okay. Can everybody see my screen now?
Yes.
Great.
Sorry, Amy.
No, that's okay.
Now it's back. Just let me know when you need to go to the next slide.
Okay, so this is a joint work with many colleagues who are listed here. And so I'm going to be presenting the results about how the adoption of oil palm production in Indonesia has affected food choices in indigenous communities. Next slide, please. So these are findings from our DFC project that was called From Growing Food to Growing Cash. And this was joint work between the Center for International Forestry Research, C4, with the University of Brawijaya, Poltekkes Pontianak, Poltekkes Jayapura, and Penn State University. Next slide, please. So just some overall background for the Indonesian context in which this study took place. So like many other places in the world, Indonesia has been going through a rapid nutrition transition. There are very high rates of child stunting that have been pretty stubborn, and despite increases in income and reductions in poverty, stunting has not really gone down very much. At the same time, there's been, over the last couple decades, major increases in overweight, obesity, and diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. And on that's on the diet side, but Indonesia has also been very well known for major deforestation and landscape change. So I work for the Center for International Forestry Research, and we focus, not surprisingly, on forests. We were interested in this project in looking at whether there was a connection between land use, particularly for oil palm, which is the major driver of deforestation in Indonesia, and whether this was linked at all to changing diets in rural Indonesia. But this change in land use, particularly for oil palm, is also very much linked to changes in livelihood strategies, which is the topic of today's webinar. Next slide, please. So before starting out the project, this was kind of the map that we had in mind of how oil palm expansion could potentially affect food choice. So on starting like at the top, the first hypothesis was that expanding oil palm would improve infrastructure, which would increase the availability of foods for markets, which would then lead to an increased consumption of these market foods. It was also, we also assumed that when people work in oil palm, that they have higher incomes, which would improve the affordability of market foods, also leading to a consumption of more market foods. But that this increase in wage labor could affect time scarcity, which might affect the desirability, especially of convenience foods, which we then assumed would also likely lead to more market food consumption. On the flip side, as people are changing from their traditional livelihood strategies, so for example, farming in one of the sites where we worked is based on swidden cultivation with multiple crops grown and wild foods collected. So we assumed that as people switched to oil palm, they would be growing fewer types of crops and maybe fewer crops, period, which would reduce the availability of own farm production, which would then lead to a decrease in consumption of those kinds of foods. And the loss of forests would both reduce access to wild foods from forests and potentially also affect the natural abundance of wild foods. So, and with that likely leading to a reduction of the consumption of wild foods. So these were the kinds of things that we were thinking going in. And we maybe naively thought that we could track all of these things and find evidence one way or the other. So that's a kind of a guess of what we're not going to be able to do by the end of the talk, but I'll walk you through some of the things that we did find. So next slide, please. We had two study sites for the project. One was in West Kalimantan, and the other overall site was in Papua. But in Papua, we couldn't find a large enough sample size in just one of the districts. So we actually did the study in two districts in Papua and one in West Kalimantan. Next slide, please. So the idea behind the study was that it was a space for time substitution with half of our sample still practicing traditional livelihood strategies and the other half having converted to oil palm. And so it's a bit different in the West Kalimantan site versus the Papuan site. So in both sites, we only surveyed indigenous households. They were Dayak households in West Kalimantan and indigenous Papuan in Papua. In the Papuan site, within the same communities, different households had different livelihood strategies. So some were the main livelihood traditional livelihood strategy in Papua. It was hunting and collecting wild foods, with some small farming as well, and there were people within the communities that worked in oil palm as well. In West Kalimantan, it was when the oil palm is done at the village level. So a village will decide to, as a community, to convert to oil palm and to give the land to an oil palm company. So we looked for villages that were close to each other in the same district, some which had converted to oil palm and some who had not. In both study sites, we had about a half-half split of mother-child pairs for both the traditional households and the oil palm households. In the West Kalimantan site, we were able to survey in the pre and post-harvest season. So we did 2 rounds. In Papua, we were only able to do 1 round. And so we did focus group discussions with both men and women, a 24-hour quantitative dietary recall for the mother-child pair, and anthropometric and hemoglobin assessments. Next slide, please. So, so these are some of the findings about the dietary patterns. So for today's talk, I'm really focusing on the food choice part to match the theme. So you can see here the major differences in comparing. So the green are the traditional livelihood strategy group, and the orange are the oil palm group. So children in the oil palm households had significantly more, and I mean that both in terms of magnitude and statistically, dairy consumption, egg consumption, and sweets consumption. On the other hand, the children in the traditional household, so those are the Swidden cultivating households, had more fish, more dark green leafy vegetables, and more fruit. In the traditional households, so it's called FC here, which is a little bit confusing, I'm sorry. It's FC stands for food crop, but these are the traditional livelihood strategy households. The children also consumed more rice. So that's the general pattern in terms of the comparison that we saw for the children in West Kalimantan. Next slide, please. In the Papua site, we saw for the oil palm households, the children had more eggs, but they're very small amounts. So I mean, less than 2 grams, so not really nutritionally relevant, but you can sort of start to see what we think is this pattern emerging. They also had more vegetables and more highly processed foods. Again, still small amounts, but it's sort of the trajectory that is also substantiated. I'm only presenting the results for the children today, but the mothers followed the same pattern. And for the mothers, the amounts of highly processed food consumption was actually higher. And on the flip side, the children that were in the households where their parents were still practicing traditional livelihood strategies, the kids were eating a lot more fish, a lot more fruit. And if you move to the staple figure to the right side, you'll see they also ate a lot more tubers. And so in Papua, in these regions where we worked, it's not true in all of Papua, but in the regions where we worked, sago is the main traditional staple food. And so the kids in the oil palm households were eating a lot more rice. So that's the main cereal. And the kids in the oil palm households were eating, I'm sorry, in the traditional households were eating, still eating a lot more sago. And this reminds me of some of the things that Amy was talking about earlier. about government programs affecting some of these choices. So the government in Indonesia subsidizes rice consumption for poor households. So that's part of what's going on here in the transition from the traditional sago-based diet toward moving towards the heavier rice consumption. Next slide, please. So to summarize, what we saw in the West Kalimantan site was that the kids were eating more dairy and more eggs and more sweets, less rice, less fish, less fruit, and less dark green leafy vegetables. Next slide. In the Papua site, the kids were eating more rice and more vegetables and more highly processed foods, but less sago, less fish, and less fruit. Next slide. So just to come back to what our motivating hypotheses were to start off with, and I didn't want to bombard you with data. So I'm just going to kind of summarize what some of our findings were to kind of bring us back to the big picture. So for hypothesis 1, we had assumed that there'd be better infrastructure in the oil palm communities. So this is more for West Kalimantan because in Papua, they were many times in the same community. But we thought that there would be a difference for market access, but we actually didn't really find that so much in West Kalimantan either. And that's because the sources of market foods are very varied and very flexible, and especially in Indonesia. I think, which is different from other places where I worked before, there are mobile vendors. So guys on motorbikes, mostly guys on motorbikes who come to even relatively remote areas and bring food that people purchase. So even if the roads aren't so good and the formal markets are far away, people still have pretty good access to a range of foods. So we didn't really find that there was that much going on with hypothesis 1. Hypothesis 2, we didn't measure income, but we did measure wealth by looking at various asset ownership. And we did find, as we had assumed, that the oil palm households were generally wealthier. The time, which we tried to do some time use modules, and we didn't really find much conclusive from our time use module. We did find, so overall this last arrow about the consumption of market source food, we did find a much higher proportion, especially for some food groups, of market purchased foods in the oil palm households in both sites compared to either growing foods or collecting foods. And then for the bottom half, we did not actually find much difference in the numbers of crops grown between the oil palm households and the traditional households, as we had assumed we would on hypothesis 4. We didn't measure quantities grown. And we did see that there was, from focus group discussions, we didn't measure this. We had a hard time trying to actually measure without doing very expensive biodiversity work, but we did find from focus group discussion that there was less access to wild food, but we also found that both oil palm households in both sites actually were continuing to hunt and collect wild foods, just not as much. So overall, we did see more consumption of homegrown foods and wild foods in the traditional households compared to the oil palm households. But the reasons behind these are very hard to disentangle. Next slide, please. Thanks. So just to sum up, we did see different dietary patterns and food choices between the traditional livelihood strategy households and the oil palm households, which we are assuming are from livelihood changes, because that, of course, that depends on our space for time substitution, whether that really holds. But it's very difficult to disentangle the different drivers because they all overlap. So there's landscape change, the deforestation, the replacement of forests with oil palm, But at the same time, there are these increases in income and these lifestyle changes. So not just amount of time, but also the organization of time when you go to work, when you take rests, with whom, and all of these things overlap. We did not see big differences in market access, but we did see differences in market use. And we see what we call dietary benefits and dietary costs of the changes in livelihood strategy, which is why I showed you those slides kind of over again to show what we think are some really strong patterns of a nutrition transition, kind of the traditional nutrition transition we're seeing in the West Kalimantan side. In the Papua side, it's more of a nutrition transition, we think, to sort of an Indonesian diet. And so we're left with trying to grapple with what we see as the major policy challenge of keeping the dietary benefits of these changes. So in this case, overall, I would say more dairy and more eggs for children, which we think are an important benefit of these changes, but also keeping in mind that we see these costs with less vegetables, less fruit, less fish consumption. Thank you very much. Next slide, just to say thank you to everybody and to thank the donors and the audience for your kind attention.
Great, thank you very much, Amy. All right, wonderful. So our last presentation is from Stella Nordhagen. So Stella? That's great. Stella, we're not hearing you if you're talking.
Stella, could you say something just to make sure we can hear you? Stella, just so you know, we can't hear you at the moment. You might need to check your audio settings. Though I think we could hear you earlier. Stella, we still can't hear you. Would you mind? I think you're unmuted. Stella, would you be able to go in your audio settings? So if you, the little arrow next to the mute button, if you click audio settings, you'll be able to toggle which microphone and speaker that the Zoom is accessing. That might do the trick.
Do we have any luck now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, very sorry about that. We did do multiple test calls and everything worked perfectly in the test call, but of course, as soon as we went live, it did not. So very sorry for that. And now let's try again. Okay, now hopefully we have a screen and we still have a voice.
We do, thank you.
Thank you very much. So yes, I'll be adding a third perspective to the conversation on how livelihoods can function as drivers of food choice by focusing on some insights we drew from our study of mining, artisanal gold mining areas in Guinea. And I'm presenting today on behalf of a large study team from Helen Keller International, the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and Julius Nyerere University of Can-Can, Guinea. The team led by PI Rolf Clem, who's also joining us on the call today. And before we get into too many details about our study methods and results, I wanted to answer a really basic question first, because it might be in the minds of some of the people on the call today. What exactly is artisanal gold mining? So artisanal mining is done informally on a fairly small scale by individuals or groups of individuals. In Guinea, it includes men as well as women and sometimes children. In this case, we're focusing on gold. So in informal sites, like the one that you can see here in this picture, and typically what one does is one digs a borehole down into the earth up to 40 meters deep. Then somebody descends down that hole and starts to dig to bring up dirt that might have metal ore in it. People on the surface haul that ore up to the surface by hand, where it's then washed, again by hand, usually using very little mechanization. And at the end of the day, you earn what you found in gold that day. So it's a livelihood that's really very much dependent on hard work, but also this element of chance and uncertainty. Now, artisanal mining is truly a global livelihood. The World Bank estimates that it occurs in about 80 countries, supporting approximately 100 million people. And within Guinea, it supports about 12% of the population who are either directly involved or living in households where somebody in the household mines. Now, mining's interesting. Artisanal mining is interesting to look at not only because of this large scale, but also because it's an example of a non-agricultural livelihood that one can pursue in a rural area. So it might give us some insights into food choice issues for this type of rural non-agricultural community more broadly. So our drivers of food choice study design consisted of selecting 18 mining sites along with the villages and camps that were associated with them in the province of Can, Guinea, which is shown in the map here in the top right. And we used a multi-phased approach in our study in which one phase of data collection informed the next, and that allowed us to modify our areas of inquiry as we went along based on emerging results and information. In the first phase, we undertook site visits, observations, and consultation with various local stakeholders. The second phase was our biggest phase, and it consisted of a cross-sectional household survey with a sample size of about 600, a set of in-depth interviews with young single miners, with mining mothers of young children, and with vendors of food at mining sites. We also undertook observations of food preparation, storage, and feeding with the same mothers of young children. And we undertook market surveys every quarter, focusing on 7 or 8 markets that serve the mining sites. In addition, we did additional consultation with stakeholders to discuss our emerging results and the future directions for the research. Our final phase was the most focused, and it involved additional in-depth interviews, again with mining mothers of young children, as well as food vendors. And we undertook more qualitative observations of the market context in these areas. And before I get into the results, important to note just one caveat, which is that this was not a comparative study. We didn't look at mining populations and compare them to non-mining populations, as was used in the previous presentation. So we can't say anything definitive about there being a causal link to mining. Rather, when I make statements about how we think livelihoods might be influencing food choices, those are based on the participants' own words and explanations for what was going on, as well as what we saw in the data. So considering now our results, first of all, what do people eat in these areas? Our data, we collected extensive data on diets using standard diet questions. And overall, that data revealed that the typical meal is very much not what we see in the picture here. Instead of being diverse and brightly colored like that, it's very much dependent on staples, often a single staple, such as rice or maize meal or millet, complemented with only a small amount of sauce based on vegetables with a bit of meat or fish. And as a result of this, diets tend to be fairly poor overall. Among women, we found that less than a quarter of them met the standards for dietary diversity, and they had limited consumption of meat, dairy, and egg, with less than 30% of respondents eating each of those on the day prior to our survey. Similarly, young children, only about 20% met the standards for minimum dietary diversity or for minimum meal frequency, and they had a limited intake of fruit, vegetables, eggs, and dairy. We also looked at levels of food insecurity and found that about half of households were food insecure, with 27% of them being severely food insecure. So the overall picture that we see in terms of diets and food insecurity, it's not a very pretty one. These are not the diets that we would expect to be supportive of maximal health. So what do livelihoods have to do with this? When we were looking through our results, we identified 4 main pathways through which we thought that mining livelihoods might be influencing food choice. And the first of these, as was brought up in the other 2 presentations, has to do with food availability. So mining in these areas is an alternative to agriculture for at least part of one's time. And this means that most households in these areas get little or none of their main foods from their own production. Only about 16% of households have access to food from their gardens, and only a little more than half had produced field crops at any time in the prior 2 years. Instead, they're much more dependent on markets than one might expect in rural areas. The picture shown here contrasts a mining site market on the left-hand side to a main urban market that's in the same region. And you can see here that basic ingredients might be available across all markets, things like salt, sugar, rice. But there's a lot of different types of foods like grains, legumes, vegetables, fruits, certain animal source food that you can't find in all of the markets. But at the same time, mining creates its own economic ecosystem and local food system. Mining sites host numerous mobile vendors of prepared foods, things like sandwiches, as well as basic cafes, such as the ones that are shown in the pictures here. Our survey data showed that from their home, about 90% of respondents had a prepared food vendor within a 15-minute walk, whereas fewer than half had access to a large food store, and only about 60% had access to an open-air food market. At the same time, there was widespread availability of processed and packaged products, things like sardines, soft drinks, industrially produced cookies and candies, as well as prepared foods like sandwiches. These were things that once would have been available only in urban areas, but now we found that they were available in all of the markets that we studied, compared to fewer than 75% of those markets having things like legumes and several different types of vegetables on offer. So overall, we found that mining decreases availability of some types of foods, but it increases availability for other types of foods. So there's kind of a dual tension here. Second pathway that we identified for how mining livelihoods might influence food choice had to do with food affordability. So mining takes place in fairly remote areas with limited supply chains, electricity, and poor roads. As a result, the prices are high for a number of nutritious foods options, things like beef or chicken, particularly compared to processed food and staples like maize. Prices at mining sites are often higher than those in towns for the same goods. And these elevated prices exist alongside somewhat elevated incomes. But as I mentioned earlier, artisanal miners are really dependent on this element of chance, and so they have highly variable incomes, which, as is illustrated in the photo here, depend on how much gold they happen to find from one day to the next. Our survey data showed that the average weekly earnings for a miner were about $13 US, going up to about $45 in a good week. But that there was really a huge range from one day to the next, 1 week to the next, and one person to the next. And we found that there was really very little smoothing of daily consumption over time. Instead of saving for the next day, most people would spend what they earned that day to buy food for that day. So one of our interview questions in the in-depth interviews tested this explicitly and asked how food choice would vary with changes in income. Somebody was asked what they would buy with the median daily income plus having 50% more or 50% less. And we found that an increase in income generally resulted in buying more fish, meat or chicken, vegetables, and oil, whereas a decrease in income generally resulted in a much weaker, nutrient-poor meal, more dependent on rice or a basic staple. We also found that income variability led to miners choosing particular vendors based on an ability to purchase items on credit from that vendor. And sometimes income variation could result in the extreme case that's captured in the quote here, in the words of a female miner. Sometimes you can spend the entire day without finding anything. And if you don't find anything, you can't eat. So affordability is very much an important driver of food choice in this setting. Third pathway we identified for shaping food choice through livelihoods had to do with food preferences. One additional constraint that mining as a livelihood places on food access has to do with time. Time availability is very limited when one is engaged in mining, and this is because mining is a livelihood where time really does equal money. The more time that you spend mining, the more chance you have to find gold, the higher your likely income is going to be. So people really want to maximize as much as possible the time that they can spend during daylight mining. And this means that there's a high weight placed on quick, convenient foods when mining and going to vendors who are located immediately nearby. As you can see in the examples in the photos here, all the foods that are sold at mining sites are available ready to eat, and they're available quickly. And there's a preference for rapid snack options, most of which are high in refined sugars and low in micronutrients or protein, things like packaged cookies. There's also a preference for foods that are perceived as being high in energy, things like coffee, energy drinks, and sweets, as further feeds that preference for ultra-processed foods. In fact, for example, we found that energy drinks are consumed more widely than dairy products among both women and young children. So children under 5 in these areas are drinking the local equivalent of Red Bull more often than they're drinking milk. We also found that sweets were consumed more widely than eggs, legumes, vegetables, or meat in the same populations. Second avenue through which food preferences are affected by mining as a livelihood has to do with the mining environment. Mines are very unclean areas. There's a lot of dirt and rubbish all around. And this means that perceived food safety and hygiene has become a key concern driving food desirability. Things that are clean are seen as being healthy when it comes to food. So vendors use this hygiene and food safety concerns to attract customers to distinguish themselves by, for example, having a clean table and clean clothes. And consumers in turn look for those vendors and seek out people who are perceived to offer safer food options. As illustrated here in 2 quotes, the first from a consumer: "The vendor I trust, it's because she's clean. It's not that I like her, it's the cleanliness." And then the perspective from the vendor: "To make sure customers come back, my food is stored in containers. This allows me to store it properly and to attract clients." So we can see that these preferences are shaping both food supply and food demand. The final pathway that I wanted to highlight for how livelihoods might be influencing food choice within this setting has to do with gender roles, time, and childcare. Artisanal mining in these areas offers a new option for earning income, particularly for women, and this can be a possibility for economic empowerment. As illustrated in the quote here, "Since I started mining, much has changed. Because if I get money from mining, I can buy domestic animals and raise them. I can help my husband with purchases. I've been able to set up my house very well. And when I leave, I can look very put together in front of others." But at the same time, mining is really hard work. In a mining livelihood, women have to spend a lot of time away from the home. They work 5 or 6 days a week, most hours of the day, all year round. And this comes with no change in their existing care responsibilities. They're still expected to be the primary caregivers of young children. The result of this is that most women will bring their young child, their child under 5, to the mining site with them while leaving the others at home. With limited time to feed the young child, worries about food safety and hygiene, and limited food choices well adapted to young children's needs at the site, this results in skipping meals for young children or in purchasing packaged and processed snacks to give to them during the day. At the same time, the family that's left at home doesn't eat until the mother returns from mining. This is illustrated here in another quote from a female miner. "Mining affects housework because if I'm not at the house and I'm at the mining site, my children have difficulty finding food." So in this way, we see that livelihood choices have impacts not only on the individual working, but also on those in their family who are dependent upon them. So just to conclude with some of kind of the implications that we saw from this research for livelihood issues and food choice more broadly. Livelihood choices and transitions in low and middle income countries often reflect either serious constraints or strong motivations. In this case, we see that there are people who have limited access to resources, limited skills, living in a rural area, and artisanal mining is one of the few options available, and it can be a route to higher incomes and to improve quality of life for women as well as for their families. So these are strong forces, and when we're trying to improve diets and to address food choice issues, it's likely that it'll be a losing battle if we try to fight against them. Instead, we need to recognize that livelihood shifts bring both barriers and opportunities in terms of encouraging healthy diets, to work to lower those barriers and to leverage the opportunities. Here, the barriers that we found were limited time, highly variable income, limited access to fresh and healthy foods, and easy access to less nutritious, highly processed foods. At the same time, we saw some potential opportunities. Perhaps we could leverage the comparatively large number of vendors as an inroad to increasing access to food. We could smooth income through getting women involved in savings groups. Or maybe we could see if the shifts that we're seeing in women's roles at the mine could be leveraged to motivate transformative shifts in gender roles elsewhere in life. By taking advantage of some of these opportunities, we hope there may be avenues to improve food choice and nutrition in these communities and others in the future. Thank you very much to all of the partners on this work, as well as the donors supporting it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Stella. Okay, so we've had 3 wonderful presentations, and now we have the opportunity to consider some questions. I'll start with the ones that have been submitted in the chat, but if you have a question you want to ask orally that's not in the chat, just raise your hand, and we'll note that. So let's begin with some questions for Amy Webb or Gerard. Question was asked about, do you have information about how food was allocated in the home and in terms of food choice? And so interest in sort of differences within the home, within the family, and how that relates to perceptions and culture and beliefs. So if you could comment on that, Amy.
Sure, and thanks, Justine, for that great question. We do have quite a bit of data in terms of food allocation across households, within households across the different communities. And I will say there are some very different ways in which both meal times are done, which affects household food allocation, and then also different foods and how they're allocated across those different communities. And so for one example, in the more pastoral communities, elder women would talk about how, back when they were younger, people ate, you'd have a main meal together, but people would often eat in shifts, and there were very specific cultural guidelines around who would eat with whom. Children would eat together. Morans, the younger herdsmen, would eat together and away from others in the family. Elder men would eat separately from others. So there's a lot of separate eating and then coming together and eating. But women typically were to eat last, which is not uncommon, but they would even eat after all the cleaning up had been done. So they had to finish all of their various tasks, and then they would be able to eat. Caveat there being that they may have had more access during the day to things from within the household. I also want to clarify, because I think I had mentioned in the social valuation factors, how cattle would be sold as opposed to slaughtered for food. And actually, Justine had caught me on that. Thank you, Justine. It's not actually the cattle, the cows being sold or slaughtered for food, because that's actually not a very common practice. Cattle are very ritual in nature. They're valued for their economic bank, if you will. They will be sold in times of emergency. They will be slaughtered only during very ritual type situations. Very, very special occasions might you slaughter a cow for consumption. But really, we're thinking more of the smaller ruminants, your shoats, your goats and sheep and such. Those would be sold as opposed to being slaughtered for consumption in order to raise school fee money or smaller fees that are being more arising more frequently, so to speak. In terms of some of the shifts that we're seeing in household allocation, with the declines in milk, milk has become something that is now being prioritized. It used to be the staple, sometimes mixed with blood, as a drink for women and children, for sick people, for elders. But what we're seeing is, with the decreasing availability, milk is no longer that staple. It is now a food that has to be allocated with judicious approaches. And so children are now being prioritized for the milk consumption, and women are missing out on that primary staple. And so what we're seeing is this sort of movement away from milk as a staple and a highly nutritious staple to grains that are much less protein rich and micronutrient, which is your staple. And so prioritization within the household of these more nutritious foods is shifting, because it's no longer a staple. It's becoming a special food that's now being really allocated to children. And then there are also really interesting things around which part of the cow is allowed for which member of the household, and then certain animals that can or cannot be eaten by certain people. So yeah, there have been some really interesting shifts in that. So thank you for that question.
Okay, thank you, Amy. Amy, by the way, there's an issue, it's a Zoom issue. If you could go in to your settings for audio and reset, I suggest you reset your audio to a different microphone and then set it back, and that should probably solve it. Okay,
I'm sounding like a robot.
A robot with a speech deficiency.
Thank you, Ed.
So let's take another question. This for Amy Ikowitz. The question is about fruit consumption and the changes in fruit consumption that you observed, and is that due to particular fruits, or can you go a little deeper about what was changing there?
There are two different sites, and fruit consumption was higher for the traditional kids in both sites. What I can say is, I can't really go into like the actual composition of the different fruits because they're varied, but what we were surprised about, or I was surprised about at least, was I was expecting to see substantial wild fruit consumption. That's based on work that I've done in several countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And surprisingly, most of the, I think over 90% of the fruit that was consumed were cultivated fruits. There wasn't that much fruit purchase. So most of what we see in fruit consumption were those that were grown by the households. And there was not very much wild fruit use, if that was what was behind the person's question. We didn't see much of that.
Okay, great, thank you. A question for Stella. In terms of what are the consequences for the context there for the environment of the mining activity, and what does that mean in terms of food insecurity potentially more broadly?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I focused here entirely on kind of the diets, health, nutrition aspects, but mining also does have serious environmental consequences. It tends to be quite destructive to the land. It's also very consumptive of water and results in pollution into water, including of mercury, which is a chemical that's often used for separating gold from rock in mining. So there tend to be high levels of environmental pollution around these areas, and we couldn't definitively, prove this in our research, but it's likely that environmental degradation also kind of furthers the lower productivity and lower interest in engaging in agricultural livelihoods because they're probably less productive. There's less land and water available to do them. So this environmental challenges are also interrelated, similar to the questions that were brought up a bit earlier about kind of climate change and how that was influencing things. The hotter weather in these areas makes agriculture even less appealing and probably does force some people into selecting alternative livelihoods such as mining.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question for Amy Webb. The question was about, are the food choices that you observed and sustainable, and is there resilience about those food choices in rural settings? So I think the question is really about what does this mean going forward for the food choices and quality of diets among the people that you observed?
Thank you for that question. And I'm hoping my audio is a little bit better.
It's perfect.
Oh, good. Okay. So I think there are a number of different things to think about. In these regions where pastoralists have traditionally resided and moved cattle and other livestock, those have been areas that have been less conducive to cultivation in the first place. And increasing research, development research, ag research, environmental climate research is showing that actually pastoral cattle keeping may be the more climate appropriate strategy for specific agroecological zones. And so protecting those lands for livestock may be more appropriate as well-managed livestock. Because what we're now seeing is as as these communities have settled and shifted to other livelihoods, so crop cultivation, day laboring, we're finding that those new livelihoods are actually also becoming less resilient under climate change because climate factors are affecting the ability to grow crops in these regions. I mean, they've always been a challenging region for growing crops because they do have periods of low rainfall, but there is increasing aridity because of deforestation in the area, so that's accelerating some of the climate issues. And so some of the meat, blood, low milk consumption, wild foods may actually be in some situations the more sustainable food options under climate change and under climate variability in terms of making sure those are available for resiliency. I think that being said, the increasing ability to allow for markets to bring other foods in to support food security is not a bad idea. I'm not certain, though, that this land and these regions are able to hold as much of the crop cultivation as they're trying to do currently. Now, it depends. There are some areas within these regions that are very still conducive for crop cultivation, but others are not. So I think there needs to be some looking at the agroecological zones a bit more closely to identify the most appropriate livelihood strategy for that region. And then that in turn, I think, will inform which diet choices are going to be most appropriate from a sustainability perspective, from an environmental sustainability perspective, if that's what the question was about.
Okay, thank you. So a couple of questions for Stella that I will try to tie together. I think the questions are about who are the external actors that are involved here with these markets, and that might mean both in terms of providing services into these mining areas, but also who are the actors who are involved and how is the marketing of the gold occurring?
Yep, sure. So for the first part of the question, the people who are involved in food marketing in these sites, they're really a mix. You have some people who are kind of local to the area near where the mine is set up, and they see this as kind of a new economic opportunity that's suddenly arisen in their village, and they get involved in that as an opportunity within their own home area. But there are also others who move from urban areas or from other sites to support a given mining site when it opens. Mining sites tend to open and close fairly regularly, so there's kind of a whole economy that springs up around that site when it opens, drawing on both local people as well as people coming in from outside to take advantage of the new market, the new buyers that are there, the new demand. To the second question, so most people will sell their gold directly at the site. There are gold buyers who are there right next to the boreholes with kind of small scales to collect gold there. Then they resell it in kind of regional gold markets, which it then enters, national gold markets or directly into kind of global supply chains. So there's kind of a difference in price at each level of sale. Some people who are particularly interested in a higher price and have larger volumes of gold will try and go directly to the larger regional markets to be able to get that higher price. But most people sell locally directly at the site to intermediaries.
And then one other question, Stella, is there any government or non-governmental sort of support systems that have come about or been applied here to try to smooth out some of the irregularities in income that you noted?
There's very little. There's very little support from governments or any kind of external agencies. And I mean, need to be clear that this isn't unique for mining communities in rural Guinea. There isn't really a lot of social support systems, social protection, and civil society support available to households in rural areas in Guinea. But particularly the mining communities find themselves in a bit of a difficult position because often they're migrants from other areas within Guinea or occasionally internationally. So they have kind of weaker ties to any existing networks for social protection and social support. It's not illegal, but it's also not exactly formal as a livelihood, which kind of puts you in a difficult spot for accessing that type of support. But overall, it's in a resource poor area to begin with, and most people don't have access to any type of that government support.
Okay, well, thank you. So a couple of questions for Amy Ickowicz. One was about could the reduced collection of wild foods be due to their depletion? And then sort of a follow-up about what do you think the reductions in consumption of fish and the changes and the increases in consumption of processed foods in the POM community, how do you think that reflects ultimately on nutritional status?
Thanks. So I'm going to answer the second one first. So we did compare nutritional status in both sites between both sectors, and we did not find a statistically significant difference in stunting or overweight or underweight. We did find higher wasting in the oil palm site in West Kalimantan. And we found higher rates of anemia amongst the mothers in the oil palm sector in Papua, but we did find other differences in nutritional status. I'm not so sure, like, I'm not confident enough that we can make those, say that it's because of these dietary changes. I think it's something for other people to explore. I mean, we just, that was what we observed. I think that for the especially, I mean, this is something I wanted to say in the presentation, and this is something that we are struggling with in terms of the research team, is that we really put a lot of effort in to try to locate our sites in places that were very, very, very similar. So in some ways, maybe it's surprising that we see any changes at all, because again, like in Papua, these are households in the same villages for the most part. But at the same time, that makes it really hard to say. It makes it easier to say that these are real changes that are happening, but it's also kind of really, really zooming in on a process that's very much at its beginning stages. So, I mean, we could extrapolate and we think that, you know, come 10 years from now, this process will be way more advanced and that we're seeing it at its very early stages. So that's about the nutritional status differences. For the other question about wild food depletion. So we weren't able to measure that. From focus group discussions, people did say, particularly around the fish and somewhat on the wild meat, that the oil palm plantations were poisoning the rivers and that was killing some of the fish, so that there was less fish available for consumption. We didn't look at potential health impacts on fish. That didn't really come up much in the discussions with the communities. They were more talking about differences in the quantity. For the wild meat, which is a very important part of diets, particularly in Papua, but in West Kalimantan as well, even though we didn't see a statistically significant difference in meat consumption, the composition of meat was very different between the oil palm and the traditional communities. And people in the oil palm sites did report that the animals were further away, so that it took more time to access them. So that might be part of the reason why we saw less consumption of wild meat in the West Kalimantan site.
Okay, great, thank you. So Lizzie Saka asked a question of Amy Gerard about tools being used, and Amy replied in the chat. So Lizzie, I encourage you to look at the chat. And Deepak Sharma asked a similar question for Stella, and I encourage you to just communicate with Stella directly about that. In the last minute we have, a question was put to Amy Gerard, so we'll end with that, about what surprised you most, and what do you think is, given the findings, what's most critical to ensuring the health of these pastoralists going forward in Tanzania? So if you could answer briefly, Amy, because we're just about out of time.
I'll do my best to do brief. I think the most surprising thing for me was the ways in which different factors interacted to affect blood consumption and really change the way people perceive blood consumption. I think the one that probably is having the most significance in terms of health impacts and nutrition specifically, maybe not health broadly, but specifically nutrition, is related to declining milk consumption. And I think in terms of ways and strategies to act on that, there is definitely going to be need to improve, I think, quality of the livestock themselves and ensuring that pastoral communities are able to maintain cattle health, to maintain milk production. There may be some innovations in ways that can be done and needs to be done in collaboration with pastoral communities so that those strategies are acceptable to them as a cultural group and an identity group. But I think these declines in milk, the ways in which families are having to reallocate and prioritize milk in ways that they've not done before. And I think that in terms of maternal and child health is critical. From a chronic disease perspective, I think the transition from milk as a staple to grains as a staple, in addition to changes in physical activity patterns, are really shoving us towards some chronic disease crises as well. So I think a lot of it centers around milk.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're at the end of our time. I want to thank all of the speakers, Lihia, Amy, and Stella, and everybody who's participated by asking questions and you're listening. So thank you very much on behalf of the Drivers of Food Choice program. I'll turn it over to Sylvia if she has anything more she wants to say at the end.
No, that's it. Thanks. Thanks so much, everybody.
Okay. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you all.